Hello, I'm Adam Peoples, and I did my third research paper on the topic of the impact of data regulations on internet globalization. An introduction. User data online is handled differently from country to country. In the United States, children's internet data is protected by the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. In the European Union, internet users' data is protected by the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. Other countries have passed data handling laws in recent years or are currently working on them, such as South Korea, Uzbekistan, and Australia. I'll first talk about COPPA and children's data. COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, contains provisions regarding how children's personal data is to be handled online. An article published by J.D. Supra, titled COPPA and the Digital Playground, describes these provisions. Under this law, in order for websites to collect information about children under the age of 13, websites must obtain verifiable parental consent. This includes the data necessary to perform targeted advertising. Sites are also not to collect more information than is necessary, and to keep this information confidential. It is designed to prevent kids from being exposed to targeted ads or being tracked on the internet. I'll now talk about some state-level privacy laws in the United States. 2 states in the United States have been in the process of creating data protection legislation, California and New York. California is working on, I'm not sure if I haven't been able to find concrete information as to what has or hasn't been passed as of writing, but California is implementing the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, and New York is implementing the New York Privacy Act. Under the CCPA, users can request the data that a company possesses about them, disallow companies from selling personal data, and allow requests for the deletion of user data, according to an article published by Fortune. In other words, users can basically receive a file containing everything a company has about them, prevent companies from selling it, and allow a request for the company to actually get rid of the data. Under New York's proposed legislation, the New York Privacy Act, companies will be expected to safely handle user data without selling it. In other words, the same way a doctor handles patient records that's how it was described in the article published by Wired. These laws may have widespread effects, as they will not only apply to the states themselves, they will also apply to any entities operating within these states. In other words, if you want to do business in California, you're going to have to abide by the CCPA. Same with New York. Outside the United States, I'll now introduce Europe and the GDPR. According to an article published by ZDNet, under the GDPR, companies must have consent to collect user data or be met with hefty fines and penalties. Internet users, as of recently, you may have seen things pop up on your favorite websites talking about cookies and how the websites use them. Well, that is for GDPR compliance. They have to put those up to basically say, hey, we're using targeted advertisements on you. If you click this button, that acknowledges that it's okay for us to do so. Also, typically hidden in the fine print is options to disable that. That's what sparked this was the GDPR. The GDPR applies to all businesses that operate within the European Union. This has had international effects. For example, Google was met with a €50 million fine when they had made personalized advertising opt out rather than opt in, as reported by the BBC in Britain. Essentially, Google has made the default check marks for targeted advertising to on, which is not allowed under the GDPR. You must provide consent, and it must be known consent. It must be you deliberately clicking a checkbox to let them target you. An interesting comparison that's often made is the US's COPPA versus the GDPR in Europe. Those two are frequently compared. The provisions are relatively similar, however, the scope is quite different. COPPA is designed only to protect children, members of society under the age of 13. However, the GDPR is designed to protect members of society of all ages, adults, children, anyone really. That is the primary difference between Europe's privacy protection legislation and the United States. Several countries in recent years have begun to implement GDPR-inspired legislation. Laws similar to Europe's privacy protection regulations. I'll focus on the countries of Australia, South Korea, and Uzbekistan. I'll start with talking about Australia. In Australia, user data handling is regulated by an act called the Privacy Act. The initial form was passed in 1988. They've proposed some changes that will bring it closer to Europe's General Data Protection Regulation. The main change would be that companies would have to stop using and disclosing a customer's personal data upon request. Currently, in Australia, a company can share a user's data however they'd like, and, well, the goal of this proposed law is to stop that. In South Korea, data handling in South Korea I'll talk about next. As reported by an article by ZDNet, South Korea is looking into strengthening its data protection laws for children. Until now, in order to collect data from children under the age of 14, parental consent had to be collected. The law, however, made it unclear how consent was to be obtained. This led companies to basically do things like put a box on screen saying yes or no, do you consent for your child to do this? And anyone could just hit yes. There was no way to verify that it was actual consent. Or a company could possibly just include a little clause somewhere saying, if you use this, you automatically say that you have been provided consent or whatever. It's no true way to provide actual, consent. Ooh, I apologize. New legislation proposes appropriate methods by which consent can be obtained. These methods include text messages, payment information, or smartphone-based authentication. In other words, parents of these kids will be will have to text a phone number and confirm it's okay, or maybe place a small charge on a payment card of some sort and be refunded that charge, or something similar to how some companies implement regulations for children here in America. What it seems is that South Korea's approach to data privacy is much like the United States in that it is child-focused and protecting the safety of children's data rather than overall safety, such as in the European Union. Data handling in Uzbekistan. According to an article published by JD Supra, Uzbekistan is looking into implementing GDPR-like policies. The proposed legislation includes concepts such as data minimization and storage limitation. The concept of data minimization means that companies can only collect as much information about a person as is needed for a purpose. Storage limitation means that companies must delete consumer information once it is no longer needed. In other words, these two concepts together mean that companies under this law will only be able to collect as little as necessary and must delete that after it is no longer needed, ensuring privacy for the end user. That is how it is proposed anyways. Now, what is the global impact of all of this? Well, differing regulations regarding data handling affects global computing and digital information sharing. For example, as we discussed earlier, Google, which is an American company, was subject to fines in Europe for not abiding by the GDPR. What this means is that if a company wants to do business in a place like Europe, they must obey Europe's General Data Protection Regulation and its policies, or not do business there whatsoever, or continue to do business and face fines. Corporations are left with the choices of abiding by foreign privacy regulations and ceasing their business in these countries. And places like the European Union are very, very large. There's many people that live there. Many of them are internet users. So these companies find it highly profitable and desirable to do business over there. As such, it'd be beneficial for them to abide by the regulations rather than just cut them off completely. The problem, however, also is due to the fact that these companies must not only abide by Europe's regulations, they must also abide by the United States' regulations, as well as different states within the United States' regulations, as well as other countries like the ones we've discussed prior. And it becomes quite complicated to keep track of all of these laws and how they're implemented and how to avoid facing legal penalties. In conclusion, the differences in how personal data is handled on a country-by-country basis affects the safety of internet users, as well as the ability of online companies to perform international business. Some countries implement protections for all members of society, such as under the GDPR in Europe, and places such as Uzbekistan and Australia, and some protect only children, such as COPPA in the US and the proposed changes to South Korea's legislation. Users and corporate entities must be aware of international data handling regulations for the purposes of user safety and corporate compliance. Users must be aware of places in which their data is safe and where it is not safe, and companies must be aware of the different laws in the different countries and how to implement them effectively in order to avoid facing legal penalties and continue to be able to perform business in their respective countries.